Hi, hello to everyone in the audience, and thank you to Mark and to Aerospace and IAAS for having invited us today to contribute a perspective from Europe, particularly on European Union Space Surveillance and Tracking, or EUSST. And very briefly, as I begin, EUSST is a European framework and soon a program for a multilateral capability in SSA, or Space Situational Awareness, set up by the European Union, and it's been implemented through a consortium of member states since 2015, which I've had the pleasure to co-chair for the past 3 years in support of our chair, my colleague, Dr. Pascal Fauché from the French space agency CNES. And as a group of 8 member states, we pool our existing SSA sensors, we share data through a dedicated platform, and we use this data to provide services, including collision avoidance, free of charge to European users. And while EUSST aims to contribute to a safe, secure and sustainable orbital environment, it is currently, in view of the upcoming European Union space program, also regarded as an operational building block for a future STM regime in Europe. And so with this in mind, what I'd like to highlight today on behalf of our group are 2 points. On the one hand, to give you an overview on what EUSST is and its modus operandi in governance, operations and security, and then also how this activity contributes to what our global community of practice is currently exploring as space traffic management, space traffic coordination, and related concepts. And the overarching rationale for EUSST is to fuse existing sensor capabilities in Europe in order to safeguard European space assets. The aim is to contribute to the resilience of space infrastructure, attain a higher level of strategic autonomy for Europe in the area of SSA, and thus in turn then also to contribute to global burden sharing in the area. And these goals were set out in a legal basis that was passed by the European Parliament and the European Council in 2014, which describes the 3 major functions of this SST capability, namely a sensor, data and processing function and a service provision function. And this legal text also lays out our overall governance, which represents a novel model for space cooperation in Europe. Basically, EUSST is implemented by a consortium of member states represented by their space agencies or equivalents. And in 2015, we started off with France, Germany, UK, Italy, and Spain. And in 2019, we were joined by Poland, Portugal, and Romania, and have been cooperating since the beginning also with the EU Satellite Center, an agency of the EU. And in joining national sensor assets and putting them into the service of a larger community, our European users, our consortium finds itself at a very interesting zone, which is between the national entities of individual participating member states who contribute considerable own investments, particularly on the sensor side, and on the other side, the supranational body of the European Commission, which oversees our work and who is also involved or directly observes our policy-related and many of our security and technical matters. And in the past, we've managed to build a close and trusting multilateral cooperation that way. So I've just mentioned the member states' sensors. This is both the foundation of our initiative in EUSST, where we bring sensors together, but also we believe that an SST sensor capability will be a generic and indispensable element for STM. So you need sensors to generate data, complementary of course with other important data sources, for instance from operators. And it's safe to say that data from sensors will be a salient element to have a robust picture of the space situation in the years to come. And currently in Europe, we still rely to a large extent on US data, that is conjunction data messages or CDM provided by the 18th Space Control Squadron. However, we have begun to establish a network of sensors to complement US CDMs with our own data where we can and where it's meaningful for us. And you see here our sensor network of overall 50 assets for surveillance and tracking with radars, telescopes and lasers. And here we combine both legacy systems that have a solid operational track record and heritage, as well as cutting edge experimental technologies that are newer or about to go online. And from a systems perspective, you could describe this as a bottom-up approach of networking existing elements that we operate right now. And this architecture is today mainly concentrated in Europe, as you can see, but we've been enriching it and plan to continue to add further sensors as the result of dedicated architecture studies and optimization that we perform internally. And as we go along, we hope this will allow us to attain a slightly more independence of measuring assets in certain orbital regimes, always, of course, as a function of the financial resources and geographical opportunities that we have at hand, and always in view of being complementary with other networks, most notably of our transatlantic partners in the US. In terms of operations, our cooperation looks like this. This is our service provision model, which is rooted directly in the three functions of sensors, data, and services described in our legal basis. And we have agreed internally that this is a division of labor in our partnership, where everyone takes responsibility for different elements. So on the left-hand side, everyone contributes sensor data, which then goes into a shared platform. You can see represented in the middle. And this is our database, which we use for exchanging measurements, and which also forms the precursor to a European catalogue of space objects in the foreseeable future. And these data are then used to compute the products for our three services that we offer: collision avoidance, fragmentation analysis, and re-entry analysis. And we started initial operations in 2016, and today we serve users from 80 organizations, including over 130 spacecraft for CA service, which also covers the Galileo fleet, the navigation system in Europe. And across this entire value chain, we work with a very diverse set of actors, from SSA ops centers and sensors that are civilian, military, civil military, from commercial private industry, or from public research institutions, combined, of course, with shared systems that we have set up for this purpose and that we jointly operate. And working with so many different actors, of course, involves a lot of interaction and discussion, but this approach also allows everyone to do what they do best, and it allows us to tap into the entire ecosystem that we have at our hands in Europe today. And while fostering cooperation like this, our governance also enables us to preserve some fundamental security interests that cannot today be met by one single type of actor alone. EUSST is an exclusively civilian framework, but given the current landscape of actors in Europe, it must be able to function effectively also on the threshold to the dual dimension. And for this purpose, we specifically include military and security stakeholders in our formal internal governance. And this means that we can have the widest reach and inclusion possible within our perimeter without touching anyone's sovereign interests, which would be, for instance, precise information on the nature or specifications and location of certain objects that may affect the security of the EU, its member states, or of third countries. And to this end, we have a dedicated internal body addressing security, which drafts and further refines our data policy and provides classification guidance and develops requirements for information security. And in practice, this is quite complex because, being a multilateral entity, we have to navigate a variety of security arrangements in our group. For instance, all of our partners have SSA sharing agreements with the US DoD. Some of us also have classified SSA sharing agreements with each other or are active in CISPO, for instance. So there's a whole spectrum of backgrounds there, which anyone who aims for a global STM regimes in the future is also likely to encounter and to have to reconcile somehow in the future. And speaking of partners, we have been maintaining a regular working level exchange with interlocutors from the US, including the DoD and US Department of State, but in the past years also increasingly with the Department of Commerce, as the civilian element of the SSA mission in the US is currently being transferred and transformed these days. And if we think, for instance, of the main elements described in US Space Policy Directive 3 for space traffic management, and the distinction that is drawn between operational, regulatory, and global engagement provisions, we find that particularly the technical and operational element resonates a lot with our activities over here. So we see a lot of parallel ideas, for instance, between SPD-3 and EOSST with regards to sharing data and providing services on the US side through the OADR or on our side through the SST database, for instance. And right now in Europe, we're at a very interesting point of time. We're in the process of ratifying the budget for the next several years of the European Union and the legislation for a new consolidated EU space program. And this space program will, of course, include the big navigation and Earth observation program components, Galileo, EGNOS, and Copernicus, but it will also include an SST component as a successor to the current EOSST initiative, extending it further and to a fully fledged program, so it matures this way. And this SST program will further underpin resilience, space safety and space security, but it is also explicitly understood by European Union stakeholders as a practical path towards future STM in Europe, whichever way this will be manifested in the future. And for now, what we can say is that the program will be fleshed out with further STM related activities in the coming years based on the existing baseline SST capability, with additional member states who will come on board, possibly extending services to a larger user base as we're currently constrained to Europe, and generally helping to shape the discourse and the emergence of STM in Europe. So I'm hoping this has given you a first impression of what we in EOSST could bring to the table in terms of SSA capability and operation for STM. We believe that EOSST, with its achievements and also with its challenges, could potentially serve as a blueprint or a sounding board for imagining and implementing operations in other multilateral settings beyond Europe. And I'd like to conclude with a remark on something that I'm quite certain is shared by our global community as a whole and is quite evident from our program today, which is that STM needs a lot of different contributions, and we need to find ways to bring actors with a variety of capabilities on board in order to tackle a complex and unprecedented problem that's unfolding rapidly around us and is likely to be exacerbated while we're still in the process of working out a way to handle it. And with this, I thank you very much for your interest, and I look forward to your questions and the other presentations. Thank you.